the word health?
I think of humans.
Human.
Bodies.
Human. Wholeness and wellness. Being
mental health.
Physical healthy, mental health. Human. The well-being of the whole body. Okay. So throughout the chat, please utilize it as it relates to the presentation today. Feel free to come off mute and talk about anything as it relates to what may be discussed. And a part of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about trauma as it relates to health and what that means for us. And I want to set aside some time after the presentation for about 5-10 minutes to be able to answer any particular questions that you may have associated with this, if that's okay. Coronavirus disease. So we've been in a pandemic for 2 years now, as we know, as it relates to COVID, also known as COVID-19. And as it relates to health, and as it relates to this virus, we can possibly say that health at this particular time for everyone is being monitored as it relates to this particular virus. But the effects of the virus as it relates to underlying health and the effects of the virus as it relates to our emotions and our psyche, we're talking about today. And maybe even getting underneath as it relates to some different things as it relates to the emotions and the psyche today, as we go forward with the presentation. So what is mental health? Mental health is emotional health plus psychological health equals mental health. What's emotional health? So we're thinking of as it relates to our emotions, overall emotions as it relates to linking those emotions to experiences, being able to recall emotions, being able to state as it relates to a feeling and an emotion, being able to express those emotional quotient, right? So we hear of IQ, but EQ as it relates to our emotions. Psychological health, now we're dealing with the psyche, which means soul in the Greek. So our thinking patterns, comprehension, intelligence, negative thinking, positive thinking, how we comprehend information, that all has to do with psychological health. With the things that I have on the screen right now, even though these different things are put in place to help keep us safe right now, the social distancing and the isolation, the restriction and different things being closed, it's having effects on people's mental health. It's having effects on our overall health. We know that there's certain populations right now that are pretty vulnerable as it relates to COVID-19. So our elder population, vulnerable adults, small children, 5 and under, and minority populations, unfortunately, we're going to get into a little bit more in the presentation, that are being impacted the most, Black and brown people as it relates to COVID-19. So when we talk about isolation and what that means as far as isolation, and if you want in the chat, how can isolation impact mental health? How can it have effects on mental health? Restriction, different things being closed, not being able to interact with loved ones the way that we would want to. We have not been able to for the last 2 years. How can that affect as it relates to health, mental health? No one to talk to, feeling alone, right? Isolated. And there's a population right now, very much so, that feels isolated, and that's our elder population. I have some notes on the screen, a digital divide that's taking place, where our elder population not being too comfortable as it relates to utilizing smartphone, taking out a computer or taking out an iPad to be able to be present. For the last 50, 60, 70 years, coming to church faithfully, and now that stopped abruptly for this population. African Americans having, for the most part, lower access in some communities to the internet. So it's not that I don't want to be involved, I don't have access. 80% of younger adults having more access to the high-speed internet in comparison to 59% of adults over the age of 65. And there's no solution right now as it comes to COVID, correct? There is nowhere that we can go in the world and escape what is taking place right now. No state, no country where we can go and get out of this threat. "95% of the deaths that are taking place with COVID has occurred with adults 50 and up. 50 and higher. Our grandmothers, our grandfathers, 95%. You know, when we talk about the nervous system as it relates to health, as it relates to mental health or whatnot, we're talking about involuntary responses that is taking place as it relates to the nervous system. So things that we do involuntarily, like your heart and my heart right now pumping blood, that's involuntarily. We don't have to stop right now and say, okay, heart, pump blood. That's just taking place involuntarily. There's things that we do voluntarily, like get up, go to the bathroom, change the channel, different things of that nature, but involuntarily, as far as there's certain things taking place. And within that nervous system, we have a parasympathetic nervous system and we have a sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system tends to make us a little bit more anxious. Parasympathetic tends to have us more calm. And depending on, as it relates to sympathetic nervous system, that can help lower the immune system under stress. So when we look at the statistics as it relates to Black African Americans, nearly 5 times more likely to be hospitalized for COVID in comparison to their white peers, twice as likely to succumb from this. Can't help but think what more is going on as it relates to the community and the stress as it relates to underlying things that are taking place as it relates to this pandemic. I'm just going to go to the chat because I want to make sure that I feel as though I'm including everybody and what different people may be putting in the chat. Isolation promotes feelings of loneliness, void, and emptiness. Yes, absolutely. Feelings of helplessness and being insignificant. Absolutely. Looking for my cursor here. Alrighty. So in regards to insignificance, in regards to hopelessness, in regards to helplessness, with the population that was very much so loving to come and be a part of and joining and togetherness that was taking place, that can have effects as it relates to health. So what is trauma? What do we think of when we hear the word trauma? Feel free to put in the chat. Or to come off mute. Trauma. And sometimes when we hear the word trauma, we think to ourselves, no, nothing really traumatic has happened to me, right? We hear trauma and we think of 9/11, World Trade Center, Columbine, a school, being shot, a church, South Carolina, being shot, movie theater, right? When we airplane crash, that's what we think of when we think of trauma. Well, there's big T traumas, which I just named, right? We would capitalize that as a big T trauma. And there's little T traumas. COVID is a little T trauma. Isolation, withdrawal, have not seen some loved ones in maybe years right now. For some people, maybe even our elderly population, that's traumatic. And just because it doesn't end up on CNN, little traumas, doesn't mean it doesn't hurt us. So in the Greek, trauma means wound. If it left a wound, it's trauma. So if we have hospitalizations for people with COVID, 6 times higher for patients with underlying health conditions. And with those particular hospitalizations, 12 times death. Chronic health conditions being the underlying issue, and weaker immune systems is traumatic. Loved one going into the hospital and not coming back. Trauma has symptoms associated with isolation, has symptoms associated with feeling detached from people, places, things, withdrawal, sleep disturbances, appetite disturbances, nightmares, maybe even flashbacks. Funerals are different. When you lose, when you mourn, you want to be comforted. That might not be able to take place right now. Did you know that the eye has 6 muscles? The eyeball pivots multiple times a second. Multiple, 3 to 6 times a second, the eyeball is pivoting, and it's being pivoted by the 6 muscles. So your inferior oblique is pretty much underneath the eyeball. And then going back a little bit more is the inferior rectus, and then a little back a little bit more, another muscle, the medial rectus, and then your lateral rectus, your superior rectus up on top. And then coming down a little bit more is your superior oblique. And these muscles have multiple emotional sensations. So depending on where we look, how far we look, where we look, it's able to bring about certain type of emotions. But if I'm isolated, and I have to be because of safety right now, but I'm isolated. Well, Nicole, there's technology, but I'm isolated. And I'm not engaged with a lot of different people that I used to be engaged in, including when you're with individuals, you're looking at them, you're looking in the eye and having communication with them. That could bring about certain type of feelings and emotions. So what exactly is maybe taking place with mental health, right? Like, so what's going on inside as it relates to stress? How is it having effects on the body, health, right, that we were talking about? Well, first, starting with the eyeball, we know that when our eyes are looking near at something, our eyes are converging, right? People who have really good near eyesight, they're nearsighted, right? They may not be able to see distance-wise, but they're nearsighted. The eyes actually turn in to help us see something up close. So even if you took a paper and put it up to your eye right now, to help you focus on that eyeball is turning in. It does the opposite to look far. So for me to look far, far, right there, far, 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 my eyes have to diverge. They have to go out to help me focus. Stress affects the muscles in the eye. Under ongoing stress, our peripheral systems, that's right here, right? We got our peripherals. So we see here, but over here, is our peripherals that, we can kind of see what's going on as we look straight, but right here is our peripherals. Stress affects the peripherals in the eye. Under ongoing stress. I talked about the sympathetic nervous system prior on another slide, but the sympathetic nervous system, that gets activated when it's time to go into fight and flight. So what does that mean? The office is on fire. I need to get out of here to get myself into some safety. So I'm going to execute some flight. I'm going to flee to get out of here, to get into safety. I'm going to let you guys know that I really appreciated this, but I need to get myself into some safety. Then I need to pick up a phone and I need to call 911. I'm going to execute some fight. I need some healthy aggression, some energy. I need to be confident enough to let 911 know what's going on. Please send me some help, paramedic, fire, XYZ. And then once they get here and they get me out of the threats, my sympathetic nervous system starts to go into more of a parasympathetic nervous system. Homeostasis starts to take place. And hopefully I start to come into some type of neutralness. My pupils aren't as wide, aren't as dilated anymore. And I'm starting to get my body feel safe. But what happens when the threat's not removed and the threat is COVID? What happens? There's no getting out. There's no calling 911 right now. Send such and such to help me. Maybe the elderly population, they want to get out. They want to be out of their home and back in the fellowship. There's no way to go to escape this threat called COVID. And some people, unfortunately, depending on what's going on with their health, they feel as though the only way to escape might be suicide. So our retina helps us see, right? So we don't see out of our eyeball, we see out of actually our brain. Our occipital lobe, which is in the back of the brain, the eyeball is sending messages all the way back to that lobe in the part of the brain that is helping us process what we're seeing on the computer right now. And the retina, when it started in our, when we were basically an embryo in our mother's womb, is some form of brain tissue. So we have some form of brain tissue in our eye sockets. Well, the retina produces light and it's responsible for converting that light, breaking it down, right, into neuronal activity, which is chemicals being sent back to the occipital lobe of the brain to process what we're seeing right now. And we know in the retina, there's blood vessels. The blood, the blood is helping sending those images back to the brain so the brain can process immediately what needs to take place. So tying into health, right now, children haven't been in school, some a year and a half. A 5-year-old starting kindergarten school for the very first time, sitting in front of a computer. I liked recess. I did. I sure did. Play. That's how children develop. Today I'm Batman, tomorrow I'm Superman. Play, fantasy, right? Different psychosocial development as it relates to what's taking place with children. They need interaction, socialization. Human beings are wired for connection. We need to connect. And stress going on with our eyes can have a lot of different effects, as we see on the board right now, as it relates to human beings. Someone said, I said, what's health? Someone said human. So the child in the classroom that's acting out, and they haven't been in a classroom for a year and a half, and we don't know what the classroom looked like at home, and what parameters were being put in place with the child. And now they're having difficulty focusing, which is what's done with the eye. Remember those 6 muscles we talked about? But we don't know the stressors that's been in that home for a year and a half. Maybe at least when they were in school, they were getting 2 meals a day. That may have changed when they were at home, and mom was doing everything she could as an essential worker, frontline staff, and still maintaining her health the best way that she could. So there's some stressors and different things taking place with this child who's now sitting in a new classroom 2 years later and having to focus with their eyes. And he's being called on to read, and he might not know how to read that well. And I'm not going to sit here in front of my classmates and look like I don't know what I'm doing. So I'm going to cut up and act out. We know that children with learning problems, large number of children, have some reduction of sensitivity as it relates to their peripheral vision. Stress on the muscles of the eye. So in fight and flight that we talked about, unfortunately, my office was to get on fire, what Miss Nicole would have to do when fight and flight is activated or whatnot, the pupils dilate, which is get wider. As we start to come down, the pupils come back to their original site, they start to constrict, but too much constriction has a lot to do with stress and emotional trauma, going back to trauma. And I asked what your definition of trauma was. That says emotional trauma, not so much physical trauma. Physical trauma can be a lot of different types of traumas, from assault to abuse, putting your hands on someone, to medical trauma that can take place with people. But emotional traumas that are happening every single day, and the effects it can have on our overall health, going back to the eye that we were talking about. So I'm a certified brain spotting practitioner. And what we do with brain spotting basically is help explore reflexes. So just like, your doctor hits you in the knee a little bit to see what's going on with your reflexes and different things that nature, depending on what's going on with someone with acute trauma and emotional stress going on, the eyes being able to help let them know where some form of stress is stored in the body. So the trauma therapist isn't just working with the individual in regards to what we think therapy is, right? Talk therapy, sitting in front of someone, but physiological body, the health as it relates to the individual. And the founder of Brain Spotting, Dr. Gran, he talks about as it relates to disorder, right? So in psychology, in counseling, psychiatry, we have something called the DSM, which is the Diagnostical Statistical of Mental Disorders. It's the manual that professionals have to utilize before you render a diagnosis. And there's a criterion that a person has to meet. You don't just get a label. There's a criterion that a person has to meet as it relates to this particular issue, right? So Dr. Grant talks about the need of moving away, now that we're getting more into the medical of mental health and the health as far as what's going on with the person, moving away from disorders and calling it dysregulation. And he says, if I go into the kitchen and I'm cooking and I burn my hand and it has a reaction, it turns red, it does whatever it is that it's doing. Is my hand disordered, or is it having a normal reaction to an injury? It's having a normal reaction. It got burnt. And physiologically, there's things taking place with the hand, with the skin, the epidermis, and different things of that nature as it relates to this injury. We wouldn't call it a disorder. I wouldn't stigmatize my hand. If anything, I'm going to try and do whatever I need to do to make this, some of this pain go away. So reactions, are people having a normal reaction to COVID? You said in the chat, isolation, helplessness, a feeling of insignificance. A 75-year-old woman who has served her whole life in the church, maybe now feeling insignificant because she's isolated and does not know how to work her smartphone. Normal reaction to an injury. What stigma? What do you think stigma is? You can feel free to use the chat.
Something negative associated with you?
Negative associated with a person. It's okay, I'm going to go to the chat. So I missed some comments. Alrighty. Ooh, some people put sick, hurt. It's good to know that we have help and resources out for the people who can have hope. Sick, hurt, deep pain. When we were answering trauma, okay, distress and pain, a stage in life that was traumatic. Scars, that's good. Trauma means a critical state of being. It does bring that about. Trauma is feeling deep distress or disturbances from the norm. An opinion. Okay, here we go. A bad label someone places on you. Yeah, that's good. A mark. Dishonor. Wow, a mark of disgrace. A bad label. No one wants to be called anybody but what their name is. When we were in school, when we were in class, when your name was called, you raised your hand or you said present or whatever the teacher had you answered to your name. Words hurt. I come from the generation where we heard people say sticks and stones can break your bones, but words will never hurt. They hurt and they stick. And it's like a label that has been placed on you. A mark. When you physically hit someone, you leave a mark. So maybe even with certain labels and stigmas, we leave marks on people. But the bruise heals and goes away, or we see it heal and go away. So those are just some statistics as it relates to what's taking place in the state of North Carolina as it relates to this threat that we're in called COVID, that we've been in for over 2 years now. Well, March will be 2 years, excuse me. And what the Department of Health and Human Services reported as it relates to the total deaths, and this was as of yesterday, I believe, 20,904 total deaths that have taken place within the last 2 years due to the COVID pandemic. The PNC Arena, which is located in Raleigh, seats 18,680 for ice hockey and 19,722 for basketball. It's the largest indoor arena in Raleigh and the second largest venue in the state of North Carolina. Deafs in North Carolina would fill the entirety of the PNC arena. That's a lot of coffins. And we talked about on previous slides, correct? 95% was the number as it relates to associated with those deaths are the elderly. And we saw on the other slides associated with the elderly, African Americans, higher rates than any other race of people. So that number is staggering for our community. So now faith. As to knowing a little bit more as it relates to the health and the science associated as it relates to mental health, emotional health, psychological health, that is impacting right now so many of our vulnerable population, our elderly, our youth. Why do we engage in church fellowship? The first bullet right there, local church fellowship. Why? Feel free to come off mute or put in the chat. Why is church fellowship important for people? Somebody has their hand up. Okay.
Hi, my name is Audrey, and to answer your question, I'm reminded of the scripture when God created Adam and he said, man should not be alone. So it's just how God created us to never be alone. He said he'll never leave or forsake us. And then also being around a group of people with the mindset of God will help uplift you and guide you during the walk.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So going back to that isolation piece, right? And even God has it in his word that it's not good for man to be alone. Why else? Church fellowship. Why is it important? Now faith during this time, the times that we're in, now that we're getting a little bit more information in regards to the effects of health and how stress can have on our health. We saw what it can do just with the 2 eyes. Why the local church fellowship being important to help? Anybody else want to come off mute? I'm going to go to the chat. It breaks up the isolation, support, in a sense of belonging, to build one another, to worship together, accountability, don't forsake the body of the church, releases stress. That's good. So that we can learn from others, build our knowledge with the same mindsets, connection. Yep, human beings need connection. Socialization, mental strength, sense of belonging, support. It touches all the senses. Yep, all the senses. Touch, hear, smell, taste, see, plus our spiritual being, tapping into the spirit, okay? We need the fellowship of the church to keep us focused. The Bible even talks about it in Hebrews 10, chapter 10, verse 25, not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as ye see the day approaching. To feel love. Absolutely. Absolutely. That makes me think there was a research study done, Yale in New Haven. And they found in this research study in regards to failure to thrive. So, right, most moms know about checks that after having your baby, and the well checks that have to take place with the pediatrician those first weeks and months after the baby, make sure they're meeting certain developmental milestones. These babies were not thriving. And moms in this research study were completely trying to understand why they weren't, telling the doctors, I feed, I this, I that, they eat when they're hungry, I pick them up, like, why isn't my baby thriving? And that's why they were there at the hospital. Well, they began to watch the parents interacting with these infants that were not thriving. Because even the doctors were somewhat trying to understand what was going on, why they weren't putting on weight, why these infants were not doing well. And they were finding in the interaction lack of touch. That there was a lack of touch taking place consistently with the babies and their mothers, their fathers. So when someone said the five senses, there's a communion that takes place as far as being amongst people and being able to touch and to hold and to feel. And that was our first language. So before you said, "Mommy, that hurts, I have a boo-boo," and before I asked for my bottle, someone picked us up and just held us and touched us. That was our first language, touch. Family, friends, loved ones. So in the chat, or if you want to come off mute, why is connection right now pivotal for family, friends, loved ones, our elderly population? Why right now is that key?
Nicole. Dr. Bryant.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I was thinking that one important thing is that it refocuses us. Because there's so much emphasis when you watch the news, there's so much emphasis on death, on the COVID death, on suicide. And so when you get with family and friends and churches, it brings you back to life. What's important in life, loving your family, loving your friends, loving God, and refocusing your attention on what's important in life, what's going to build you up and strengthen you.
Yes.
To continue your life, your living, your well-being, and not get stuck in isolation of thought, not just your body being in isolation, but your thoughts being in isolation, only thinking of detrimental things and not things of life, because we know that Jesus came to give us life and more abundantly. So when we focus on him, then we renewing our strength, we renewing and refreshing our thoughts and bringing life back into our lives and of course, spreading that to others as we spread love and like you said, touch and communication, which is support and encouragement to one another.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely. If it's okay, I'm going to go to the chat. I know it tends to take up the screen, but I just want to make sure I'm including everybody. To feel love, dads know too. The fellowship shares things in common and unity with other individuals. The history and love, that's good, the history and love. It refreshes us. Absolutely. Absolutely. The history. Right? Absolutely. Check-ins. Why are check-ins important? So for some who may not be able to physically come back to the church or come back as far as fellowshipping with someone, for breakfast, or it is better maybe for someone with an underlying health condition to not be out. Why are check-ins, intentional check-ins with people, very pivotal right now and important?
It lets people know that they're cared about and they're not alone. And it also provides a sense of accountability, because then you're able to check on people that you haven't seen. So if they're missing, then you at least know that they're okay or not okay. And then
Or
you'll
not
know
okay.
exactly what to do next.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You guys have probably seen some of the reports in regards to Miss USA. And she actually represented North Carolina. She was an attorney as well. I think she received her MBA. She had an MBA. And they're talking about in the media high functioning depression. It's not a clinical term, but high functioning depression, and how her face right now is being associated with this term, that everyone